July 1969. A man steps off a ladder onto another world and says a sentence the whole planet will remember. It looks like one man, one small step, one giant leap. It was not. Behind that single boot stood 400,000 people, $25 billion, a Cold War, and a price that few of the cheering crowds were counting. For the last minutes of the descent, the most expensive machine ever built came down to one human being and his nerve. The landing computer flashed alarms no one in the cabin had seen in training. Code 1202, then 1201, warnings that it was overloaded. On the ground in Houston, a young engineer judged them survivable, and the descent went on. Then the automatic guidance steered the lander toward a field of boulders the size of cars. The man at the controls took the machine off automatic and flew it himself, low and level, hunting for a clear patch of ground while the fuel gauge fell. He set it down with seconds of fuel left in the tank. His first words from the surface were not poetry. They were an address, a place that had not existed an hour before. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. The space agency would have reached the moon with someone in that seat. But this particular landing, on this day, came down to this particular pilot, a man who flew, a colleague once said, as if the aircraft were a suit he was wearing. That is the honest version of the legend. Not that without him there would have been no space program, but that the success of the step itself rested on a calm engineer who, for the rest of his life, would refuse to be turned into a hero. The skill is real. The achievement is real. The film exists. The footprints are still there. The question is, what order stood behind that achievement, what it cost, and who was left outside the gate while the rocket climbed? To answer that, the story has to begin not in Ohio and not in Houston, but with a rocket and with the man who built it, whose genius the United States bought, and whose past it chose not to look at too closely. The rocket that carried the Apollo astronauts to the moon did not begin in America. Its chief architect was a German engineer named Wernher von Braun, born in 1912 in Prussia, a man who had dreamed of spaceflight since boyhood, and who would build, over 30 years, the most powerful machines of his age. Without him, the early American space program would not have moved as fast as it did. That much is plainly true. The rest of the truth is harder. In Nazi Germany, von Braun led the team that built the world's first long-range ballistic missile, the V-2, Vergeltungswaffe, vengeance weapon. He joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and held the rank of major in the SS. The rocket was a real technical leap, the first human-made object to cross the edge of space, arriving faster than its own sound. Fired in their thousands against London and Antwerp from 1944, the V-2s killed around 8,000 people, almost all of them civilians. After British bombers struck the Peenemünde Rocket Center in 1943, production moved underground into a tunnel complex near Nordhausen. The labor came from a concentration camp attached to it, a subcamp of Buchenwald codenamed Dora. By the official figures, at least 12,000 forced laborers died there building these rockets. Later estimates run as high as 20,000. The V-2 is the only weapon in history whose manufacture cost more lives than its firing. As Germany collapsed, von Braun and his core team surrendered to the Americans rather than the Soviets. Under a secret program called Operation Paperclip, around 125 German rocketmen were brought to the United States, their files quietly smoothed. They built the Army's missiles in Huntsville, Alabama. In 1958, a rocket from that family lifted the first American satellite into orbit. 2 years later, von Braun became director of the new space agency's Marshall Center and chief architect of the Saturn V, the booster that would throw men at the moon. Almost none of that past was ever tested in a courtroom. Of the paperclip men, only one was ever formally tried, and none was found guilty. The reckoning came late. As recently as 1984, Arthur Rudolph, who had directed V-2 production in the tunnels, gave up his American citizenship and returned to Germany under threat of prosecution. The country had built its road to the moon on engineers whose files it had agreed not to read too closely. Von Braun, for his part, did not hide. In 1950s America, he became the public salesman of spaceflight, charming, certain, on magazine covers and television, promising the suburbs a future among the stars. The dream he sold was real, and the public bought it. What it did not buy, and mostly did not ask about, was the first chapter. He left the space agency in 1972 and died 5 years later. A crater on the moon carries his name, a fitting and uncomfortable honor for a man whose machines reached it and whose first machines were assembled by the doomed. None of it would have happened without fear. On the 4th of October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, a metal sphere that crossed the American sky every 90 minutes and beeped. It was a triumph of science and a message of menace. A nation that could put a satellite over your house could, in principle, deliver a warhead there. The shock founded the American Space Agency within a year and started a race in which, at first, the Soviet Union won everything. On the 12th of April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being in space. For the young American president, the timing was unbearable. Within days, John F. Kennedy had suffered 2 Cold War humiliations, Gagarin in orbit and a failed invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. He asked his advisors for a goal in space the United States could realistically reach before the Russians. The experts told him the Soviets would lead in rockets for years. There was only one prize far enough away that the race could begin roughly even: a landing on the moon. 3 weeks earlier, America had finally answered Gagarin. Barely. Alan Shepard had ridden a rocket from von Braun's team on a 15-minute hop above the atmosphere, a fraction of what Gagarin had done, and everyone knew it. The pressure to leap past the Soviet Union, rather than crawl after it, is what made a moon landing, absurd, unaffordable, years away, suddenly look like the only move worth making. On the 25th of May, 1961, Kennedy stood before Congress and committed the nation to landing a man on the moon before the decade was out. A year later, in a stadium in Houston, he gave the speech that became the slogan of the age. America chose to go to the moon not because it was easy, but because it was hard. It was a magnificent sentence. It was also a Cold War weapon aimed at Soviet prestige as surely as any missile. There is a detail the slogans leave out. Twice, Kennedy tried to call the whole race off, proposing to Khrushchev in 1961, and again before the United Nations in 1963, that the 2 superpowers go to the moon together. Khrushchev did not take the offer, and after Kennedy's assassination, the idea died with him. The race America is remembered for winning was one its own architect had tried to turn into a handshake. It is worth being precise about what winning meant. The Soviet Union reached almost every milestone first: the first satellite, the first man in orbit, the first woman, the first walk in open space. What America won, at the end, was the single prize it had chosen precisely because it lay far enough off to be winnable. And the contest stayed close to the very end. 3 days before Apollo 11 left the pad, the Soviets launched an unmanned probe, Luna 15, to scoop up moon rock and bring it home first. It crashed into the Sea of Crises about 2 hours before the astronauts lifted off the surface to come home. The race was decided, quietly, by a machine falling in the dark. Neil Alden Armstrong was born in August 1930 on a farm near Wapakoneta, Ohio, a quiet, careful boy who built model airplanes and saved his money for flying lessons. He earned a pilot's license on his 16th birthday before he could legally drive a car. A Navy scholarship took him to Purdue University to study aeronautical engineering. 3 semesters in, the Navy called him up. He flew in the Korean War from the carrier Essex, the youngest pilot in his squadron, 78 missions. On one low pass, his fighter struck a cable strung across a valley and lost part of a wing. He nursed it back over friendly ground and ejected. He came home in 1952, finished his degree, and went looking for the work he actually wanted. Not war and not glory, but engineering. He found it as a test pilot on the edge of the Mojave Desert, flying rocket planes, including the Black X-15, which he took past 5 times the speed of sound to the edge of space. The work was lethal. Men he knew went up and did not come down. He was good at it, without drama and without display, treating each flight as a column of numbers to be balanced and survived. Our principal responsibility, he said of the job, was engineering work. It is not the temperament myths are made of. It is the temperament that lands a crippled machine with the fuel almost gone. In 1962, the space agency chose him for its second group of astronauts, one of the first 2 civilians in the Corps, an engineer first and an aviator second. 4 years later, that temperament saved his life. In March 1966, commanding Gemini 8, he performed the first docking of 2 craft in orbit, and then the joined vehicles began to roll, faster and faster, until the astronauts were close to blacking out. Armstrong worked the problem, undocked, and brought the spin under control. He had not panicked. He had flown the emergency like an engineering test. The agency noticed. No one walked onto the moon untrained. The astronauts spent years rehearsing every minute of a flight that lasted days. Simulators, centrifuges, vacuum chambers, geology, and volcanic deserts. The goal was to make the impossible boring, to rehearse catastrophe so often that on the day, the hands would move before the fear arrived. The most dangerous rehearsal was learning to land on the moon while still on Earth. The agency built an ungainly open-frame machine meant to fly like a lunar lander in Earth's heavier gravity. In May 1968, Armstrong was flying it when it tilted out of control. He ejected and floated down on his parachute. The machine hit the ground and burned. He went back to his office and, by one account, said almost nothing about it. He had been a few seconds from death, and a year later he would do the real thing for keeps. The education was not perfect. The very alarms that would interrupt the real landing, the 1201 and the 1202, were ones the crew had never met in the simulator. But the years of manufactured disaster did their work. When the unfamiliar warnings came, the hands kept flying. How he came to be first out of the hatch was, in his own word, happenstance. The crews rotated on a fixed schedule. The fire that killed 3 astronauts in 1967 reshuffled it, and Armstrong landed, by that arithmetic, as commander of Apollo 11. As he had said years before, who the man on the moon turned out to be was largely a matter of luck. The myth needs a chosen hero. The record shows a schedule. The crew was announced in January 1969. 3 men, all born in 1930, professionals rather than friends, by their own description, amiable strangers. Armstrong used what authority he had to shape the crew himself, asking for Michael Collins in preference to the man the rotation would have handed him. The quiet decision of a man who thought in terms of the team, not the spotlight. Buzz Aldrin was the scholar of the 3, an Air Force colonel with a doctorate from MIT on the exact problem the mission turned on: how 2 craft find and join each other in orbit. If the landing came down to Armstrong, the method to reach it owed a great deal to Aldrin. It is tempting to remember the moon landing as a moment when a divided country stopped and looked up together. That memory is half a myth. Across the whole decade, the program had powerful enemies, and for most of those years, the doubters were the majority. The first critic was the man Kennedy replaced. Former President Eisenhower, who had founded the space agency, attacked the moon goal as wildly expensive and of doubtful purpose. A respected mathematician at MIT called the whole thing a swindle. Many scientists argued, correctly, that robots could gather most of the same knowledge for a fraction of the cost. And the public was never sold. Surveys through the 1960s consistently found that most Americans did not believe a moon landing was worth the money. Only in the month of the launch itself did a single poll show a bare majority in favor. The doubt had a backdrop. The moon program ran through the most turbulent years of the post-war republic: a deepening war in Vietnam, unrest in dozens of cities, the assassination of Martin Luther King. To spend $25 billion on a journey to a lifeless rock while cities burned over poverty and injustice at home struck millions of Americans not as inspiring, but as indefensible. The sharpest challenge came to the gate itself. The day before the launch, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, successor to Martin Luther King, led around 500 people of the Poor People's Campaign to the Space Center in Florida. They brought mules and a wooden farm wagon to set the gleaming white rocket against families who could not afford food. Their signs read, "Billions for space, pennies for hunger." The head of the space agency, Thomas Paine, came out to meet him in the field. Paine told the protesters that if pushing the next morning's button could solve the problems they were describing, he would not push it, but that it could not, and that the country had to do both. He asked Abernathy to pray for the safety of the three men and handed over passes so that some of the poor could watch the launch from the stands. Both men, in their way, meant it. The gulf between them did not close. The criticism was not only about money. A year after the landing, the poet Gil Scott-Heron set a black family's unpaid bills against a white man's walk in space in Whitey on the Moon. In 1969, the poverty rate for black Americans stood near a third, and black Americans worked on Apollo but were largely kept out of sight. Among them, mathematicians like Katherine Johnson, whose calculations the agency itself would later call critical to the landing, recognized only decades after the rocket had flown. The footprints on the moon are anonymous, so for half a century were many of the hands that aimed them. None of this means the doubters were simply right. Apollo's defenders made a serious case that the program pulled a generation into science, that the technologies it forced into being repaid their cost many times over, and that the billions would never have been handed to the poor had the rocket stayed on the ground. Both cases are honest. The discomfort is that both can be true at once, a wonder of human reach and a monument to crooked priorities in the very same machine. Behind the one famous step lay a decade of machinery and failure. The agency did not leap to the moon. It climbed there, one test at a time. Mercury proving a man could survive in space. Gemini teaching the harder skills of rendezvous and docking. Then the giant new rocket, tested again and again without a crew. The cost of haste was paid early. In January 1967, during a ground test of the first Apollo craft, a flash fire swept the sealed cabin and killed 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, in seconds. The program stopped. The spacecraft was redesigned. Then the steps came quickly, and by the spring of 1969, a full dress rehearsal had taken a lander to within a few miles of the moon's surface. One of those steps deserves its own moment. In December 1968, fearing the Soviets might loop a crew around the moon first, the agency sent Apollo 8 to orbit it at Christmas. 3 men became the first humans to leave Earth's gravity and, turning back, to watch their own planet rise, blue and small, over the dead gray rim. The photograph they brought home, Earthrise, showed the whole Earth as a single fragile thing and helped give the modern environmental movement its defining image. The race to the moon had, almost by accident, turned the cameras around. And behind the rocket stood the people, at the peak about 400,000 of them, across the agency, the universities, and hundreds of companies. The Saturn V rose some 111 meters and burned with 7.5 million pounds of thrust, the most powerful machine ever flown. But it was assembled by hand, checked by hand, and steered by a room full of people in Houston. The step would carry one name. The work carried hundreds of thousands. For all its violence, the giant rocket never killed anyone. 13 flights, never a crew lost. A record built on the obsessive checking of 100,000 parts by people who knew a single bad weld could end 3 lives on live television. Once the rocket cleared the tower, control passed to rows of young engineers in Houston, most of them under 35, each holding the authority to call a halt. The man on the moon is remembered by name. The average age of the room that got him there and back is not. This is the heart of the matter the myth hides. One small step for man is a sentence about a single human being. The moon landing was the opposite of a single human being, the largest peacetime mobilization the country had ever attempted. And the man at the top of the ladder knew it better than anyone, which is exactly why he would spend his life correcting the legend that gave it all to him. On the morning of the 16th of July, 1969, around 1 million people gathered on the beaches and grandstands of the Florida coast. Around the world, an estimated 600 million watched on television, the largest audience that had ever existed for anything. At 32 minutes past 9, the 5 engines lit, and the tallest rocket ever built climbed off the pad on a column of fire and was gone. 3 days later, the spacecraft slipped into orbit around the moon. Armstrong and Aldrin crossed into the lander and began the descent. The overloaded computer, the boulder field, the manual flying, the fuel falling toward empty, and the calm voice reporting that the Eagle had landed. While the world watched the 2 men below, a third was flying alone. Michael Collins circled the moon in the command ship, and on every pass behind the far side, he lost all contact. No radio, no Earth, no crewmates, the most isolated human being who had ever lived. He wrote later that what he felt was less fear than awareness, that if anything went wrong on the surface, he would have to fly home by himself. 6 hours after the landing, in the small hours of the 21st of July, Armstrong came down the ladder and put a boot in the gray dust. One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. For 2.5 hours, the 2 men worked the surface. They left things behind: a flag stiffened with wire because there is no wind to lift it, medals in memory of dead astronauts and cosmonauts, Americans and Soviets together, and a plaque bolted to the leg of the lander that men from the planet Earth came in peace for all mankind. Whether the species had earned the word all was the very thing the families at the gate had been asking. The plaque is still there. So is the question. Coming home was its own ordeal. Re-entry at 25,000 miles an hour, parachutes over the Pacific, and then, in case they had carried back some unknown life from the moon, 3 weeks sealed in a quarantine trailer, waving at the president through a small window. The world did not wait with them. From Tokyo to London, crowds had watched the step in the dead of their own night and wept at the sight of strangers walking on the moon. They came home to a welcome it would have been easy to ride for life. Parades, medals, the highest honor the country could give. And Neil Armstrong, the most famous of the 3, did the one thing the myth did not expect. He stepped out of it. He left the space agency in 1971 and became, of all things, a professor, teaching aerospace engineering at the University of Cincinnati, back among students and problems. He gave very few interviews. He stopped signing autographs once he learned they were being sold. He did not cash in his footprint. When people called the landing the work of a brave individual, he turned the credit back to the hundreds of thousands behind him and corrected, again and again, the idea that any of it had been about him. He did not vanish entirely. In 1986, he helped investigate the loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger, lending his engineer's eye to another disaster. He kept faith with the work while keeping his distance from the fame, and lived quietly near Cincinnati until August 2012, when he died at 82. His ashes were given to the sea. His crewmates took other paths. Buzz Aldrin spoke openly about the depression and drinking that followed the impossible question of what a man does with the rest of his life after the moon, and became a tireless campaigner for going further, to Mars. Michael Collins wrote about the flight with rare grace and ran the museum where its capsule now hangs. He died in 2021. 3 men had gone. For decades they were bound, a little uneasily, by the 8 days that had defined their lives. It is the rarest thing in this whole series of explorers and conquerors, a man placed at the very center of a myth, who quietly declined to be its statue. That refusal is not a footnote to the story. For a documentary about how legends are made and unmade, it is the point. So what was the step, and what was it not? The achievement was real, And so was the skill. A calm pilot who landed a failing machine with seconds to spare. But the step was never a single step. It rested on 400,000 people, on a German rocket built first by the enslaved, on the largest peacetime effort a nation had ever made. And the myth was manufactured. The moon was not a pure act of discovery. It was a Cold War weapon, born of fear, funded for prestige. A race its own author had twice tried to call off, paid for at a price most Americans did not think was worth it, while protesters at the gate asked why the nation could reach the stars but not its own hungry. The race was won, and then it was abandoned. The last men left the moon in 1972, and for half a century no human traveled beyond low Earth orbit again. What remained was knowledge and image. The rocks rewrote the science of how the moon was born. The photographs changed the way a species pictured its own planet. And one image above all endured: a man in white on a gray plain, a single footprint in dust that no wind will ever erase. It is a magnificent thing to have done. It is also a more complicated thing than the footprint admits. This series has spent 2 volumes taking apart the legends of men who were sold as greater than they were. It ends deliberately with the opposite case: a genuine pioneer who took the credit he was offered and quietly handed most of it back. Neil Armstrong walked into the biggest myth of the century and spent the rest of his life refusing to be it. Of all the explorers in this collection, he may be the only one who told the truth about his own legend. That is why he closes it.